I thought I knew my wife. 38 years old, 12 years of marriage, and I genuinely believed I could read her the way I read the weather. Not perfectly, but well enough to know when a storm was coming. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about a lot of things. My name doesn't matter much for this story. What matters is that I'm the kind of man who fixes things. Leaky faucets, bad transmissions, broken friendships. I've always been the one people called when something needed putting back together. My wife used to say that was the thing she loved most about me. She said it like it was a compliment. I used to take it that way. Her name is Roxanne. Roxy. To everyone who knew her longer than 5 minutes. We met when I was 26 and she was 23, at a fundraiser for the local animal shelter that neither of us actually cared about, but both attended because a mutual friend guilted us into it. She laughed at something I said that wasn't even that funny, and I thought, that's the one. You know how it is. Or maybe you don't. Maybe you were smarter than me. We got married 3 years later. Small ceremony. Backyard of her parents' house. 100 people I half recognized, and 40 I actually liked. Her younger sister was the maid of honor. I'll get to her. The first decade was good. Not perfect. Nothing is perfect. But genuinely good. We bought a house in Clarkston, Ohio. I worked in commercial contracting. She managed the billing department for a medical group downtown. We had disagreements about money, about whose family we'd spend holidays with, about whether to get a dog. Normal stuff. The kind of friction that keeps two people honest with each other. The second decade is where things started to shift. I can see it clearly now in a way I couldn't see it then, which is how betrayal usually works. It makes perfect sense in the rearview mirror. My father-in-law had a heart attack in the spring of my 41st year. Not fatal, but serious enough that my wife spent 3 weeks driving down to Cincinnati every weekend to help her mother manage things. I went with her the first 2 weekends, then started staying home because there was a commercial job in Dayton that needed my attention, and because, honestly, I felt like I was in the way down there. Her family is close in that particular way, where they need to grieve and worry together, and I always felt like a visitor in their version of a crisis. That was the beginning of the distance, I think. Not caused by it. The distance was already there, quiet and patient. But that was when I started to notice it. She'd come home from Cincinnati and sit in the kitchen drinking decaf at 10 o'clock at night, not talking. I'd ask how her dad was doing, and she'd say better or the same. And that was it. I'd try to hold her hand, and she'd let me for a moment, and then find a reason to get up. I told myself it was grief. I told myself she was exhausted. I told myself a lot of things. By the following winter, her father had mostly recovered. He was back to walking the neighborhood every morning, back to arguing with the television during football games, back to calling me the contractor, and instead of my name, which was his version of affection. Things should have eased up between Roxy and me. They didn't. That February, she told me she'd been stressed, not about her dad anymore, just generally. The job was getting to her. She'd had a difficult year and she needed a break. She and her sister were thinking about taking a trip together, just a long weekend somewhere warm, and she wanted to know how I felt about that. I said fine. Of course I said fine. What kind of husband says no to that? Her sister's name is Tatum. She's 29, 6 years younger than Roxy, and she's been married to a guy named Breck for about 4 years. Breck is a quiet man. The kind of quiet that comes across as either very calm or slightly vacant, depending on what you think of him. I've always liked him. He works in logistics, coaches a youth baseball team on weekends, doesn't drink. Good man. Patient man. I called him the week before the trip to see if he wanted to grab dinner while the women were gone. He said sure, and we made plans to hit a sports bar out on Route 9. It was just something to do. Neither of us overthought it. The trip was 6 days. Roxy and Tatum flew to Savannah, Georgia. Or so I understood. The first couple of days were fine. Roxy texted me photos of the riverfront, a plate of shrimp and grits, the hotel pool. She seemed happy in the photos, relaxed, more like herself than she'd been in months. I felt good about it. I was glad she'd gone. On day 3, the photo stopped. I didn't panic. I told myself she was just enjoying herself, unplugging, doing what people are supposed to do on vacation. I sent her a few texts over the next 2 days. Nothing urgent, just check-ins. She responded to each one, but brief, having a great time, so needed this talk when I'm home. I didn't push. She got back on a Thursday evening. Tatum flew home the same day. Everything seemed normal. She was tired, quieter than I expected someone to be after a vacation. But I figured jet lag, or the letdown of returning to ordinary life. 2 days after she got home, she told me she wasn't feeling well. Nauseous, she said. Probably something she ate in Savannah. She scheduled a doctor's appointment for the following Monday. I offered to go with her. She said she was fine. It wasn't a big deal. She'd just go on her own. This is where I should have paid closer attention. But I didn't. I went to work. What happened next came to me sideways, the way the worst things always do. On Monday afternoon, I got a call from Breck. He said he needed to talk to me in person, that it was important, that he was sorry to call me at work. I could hear something in his voice that I'd never heard before, a kind of controlled fragility, like a man holding something heavy at arm's length. We met at a diner on the east side of town, the kind of place with vinyl booths and coffee that's been sitting on the burner since 7 in the morning. Breck was already there when I arrived. He had his hands wrapped around a mug, and he wasn't looking at the door when I walked in. He was looking at the table. I sat down across from him. He said, "I think something happened on that trip." He'd found a receipt, not snooping, or maybe a little snooping, but the provoked kind, the kind where a man starts looking because something doesn't add up. The credit card statement showed charges in Savannah for the first 2 nights, and then charges in Charlotte, North Carolina, for nights 3 through 5. Charlotte, not Savannah. He'd looked up the hotel in Charlotte. It was a nice place, the kind of place you don't end up in accidentally. He'd tried asking Tatum about it casually, and she'd gotten flustered. Said she'd wanted to surprise him with the receipt so he could see how much they'd saved on the hotel, which made no sense at all. Then she'd gotten quiet and hadn't brought it up again. I sat there listening to him, and I felt the floor tilt slightly. Not dramatically. I didn't flip the table or storm out. I just felt the floor tilt, the way it does when you realize you've been standing wrong this whole time. I drove home that night and looked through our credit card statement on my laptop while Roxy was in the shower. There it was. The same hotel in Charlotte. 3 nights, starting on the day the photos had stopped. I closed the laptop and sat at the kitchen table for a long time. I didn't say anything to Roxy that night, or the next night. I needed to think, and I needed to know more before I said anything I couldn't take back. I'm a contractor. I deal in foundations. You don't start demolishing walls until you know which ones are load-bearing. I called in a favor from a guy I'd known since college, a man named, well, it doesn't matter what his name was. He knew how to find things out. He wasn't a private investigator exactly, but he was the kind of person you call when you need information, and you don't want to explain why. He'd helped me once before with a business partner who turned out to be skimming from a shared account. That situation hadn't been personal. This one was. He found a social media profile within 48 hours. A man in his mid-40s, lived in Charlotte, worked in real estate development, divorced, no children listed publicly. His profile was mostly private, but there were photos, group shots, sporting events, the kind of curated public image that men in his situation tend to maintain. Good looking in the way that requires effort. The kind of man who had learned how to be charming the way other men learn carpentry, deliberately, with practice. His name was Albright. I don't know his first name, and I didn't want to. Albright. I showed Breck what I'd found on a Wednesday morning, parking lot of a hardware store, both of us leaning against his truck. Breck looked at the photo for a long time without saying anything. Then he said, "Tatum has a doctor's appointment tomorrow." I said, "So does Roxy." We looked at each other. Thursday morning, I called my office and said I'd be late. I drove to the medical group, where Roxy had her appointment, the same one she worked at, which I'd always thought was convenient, but which now struck me as strategically useful. I parked in the lot across the street and waited. I wasn't sure what I was waiting for. Evidence, I suppose. Confirmation of something I was already fairly certain of, but hadn't yet made real by naming it. Breck showed up at 20 minutes after 9. He parked 2 rows away from me and walked over and got in my passenger seat. We sat there watching the entrance to the building. At 9:45, Tatum's car pulled into the lot. At 9:50, Roxy walked out of the main entrance. She hadn't driven herself. She'd been inside since before I arrived, probably. She worked there. She knew the staff, the schedules, the back hallways. It occurred to me then that I had never thought carefully about what advantages that might give her. The two of them went inside together through the main entrance, which told me they'd planned to meet there. This was coordinated, that whatever they'd arranged was deliberate. We waited. 40 minutes later, they came back out. They were walking close together, the way sisters do when something's wrong. Not quite touching, but near enough to catch each other. They weren't talking. I couldn't see their faces clearly from across the street, but I could read something in the way they were moving. Careful, like people carrying something fragile. Breck got out of my car and started walking toward the parking lot. I got out and followed. They saw us at the same time. I watched my wife's face change, a sequence of expressions happening too fast to name individually. Surprise, calculation, something that might have been relief, which I didn't understand until later. Tatum made a small sound, not a word. Breck stopped 10 feet away from her. I stopped next to Roxy and I said, quietly, "I know about Charlotte." She didn't say anything right away. She looked at her sister. Her sister was still looking at Breck. Then Roxy said, "I was going to tell you." I said, "When?" She didn't have an answer for that. It came out in pieces over the next hour, standing in that parking lot, and then sitting in a coffee shop 2 blocks away, because a woman from Roxy's billing department walked by, and Roxy didn't want to be seen, which I found bitterly amusing. They'd met Albright online, both of them, separately, without knowing the other was talking to the same man. Roxy had matched with him on some app she'd apparently downloaded the previous fall. Tatum had met him through a travel group on social media. He'd been cultivating both of them simultaneously for months. He was charming, she said, as if that explained anything. He made her feel seen. He listened. He remembered details. The trip was his idea. He'd suggested that Roxy and Tatum happened to be in Savannah at the same time he was attending a conference nearby, and they could all meet up. Neither of them had known the other. Was also talking to him until they were already on the plane, and Tatum had mentioned the name of the man she was hoping to see. And Roxy's felt the world tilt the same way I would feel it tilt later. Listening to Breck. They'd still gone to Charlotte. This is the part I've turned over in my mind more times than I can count. They'd found out on the plane that they'd been played, and they'd still gone. I asked Roxy Damatz about this once, weeks later, when we were further along in the process of ending things. She said she didn't know how to explain it. She said he was very persuasive. She said she wasn't proud of it. I believed her about not being proud of it. I didn't find it particularly helpful. Breck handled it differently than I did. He said almost nothing in that coffee shop. He just listened. Very still, the way he always is. And when Tatum finished talking, he stood up and put on his jacket and said he needed to go pick up the dog from the groomer. Then he left. I watched him walk out and I thought, that man is going to be okay. There's a kind of damage that makes people stronger, and Breck seemed built to absorb it. I stayed for another 20 minutes. I asked the questions I needed to ask. Then I called my attorney. Not a divorce attorney. Just my attorney. A woman who handled my business contracts but who I trusted absolutely. And I told her I needed a recommendation. She gave me 3 names. I called the first one that afternoon. Here's what I learned from that process, if it's useful to anyone. The impulse to go after the other person is a trap. I understand it. I felt it. That pull toward Albright, toward Charlotte, toward doing something that would register in some physical, concrete way. But my attorney, the divorce attorney, a dry and precise man named Quentin Foss, who'd been through this particular situation approximately 500 times, told me the same thing twice in our first meeting, which meant he really meant it. The man in Charlotte is not your problem. Your problem is here. Protect yourself here. So that's what I did. The divorce took 11 months. Roxy moved out in April, into an apartment not far from her parents. I got the house, which we'd paid down significantly over 12 years, and which I'd renovated myself, room by room, during the evenings and weekends of our marriage. I wasn't sentimental about keeping it so much as practical. It was worth keeping. It was a good house. I knew every beam in it. Tatum and Breck separated around the same time. I stayed in loose contact with Breck through the whole thing. We'd text occasionally. Nothing heavy, just 2 men keeping a line open. He started coaching again in the spring. He seemed like himself. Albright, as far as I know, faced no consequences that I was responsible for. Quentin told me that the best outcome for me had nothing to do with Albright, and he was right. I've made my peace with that. Most days, the part of this I wasn't prepared for was the loneliness of the middle stage, not the acute pain of the beginning, and not the quiet that comes eventually at the end, but the long, hollow middle months, where you're living in a house you know by heart, and sleeping in a bed that's too large, and eating dinner, standing at the counter, because sitting at the table for one feels like a statement you're not ready to make about your life. I got a dog in October, a 3-year-old basset hound from the county shelter named something embarrassing that I won't repeat. I renamed him Ford because he was sturdy and reliable and mildly inconvenient, in ways I found oddly comforting. He sleeps at the end of the bed and snores, and takes up more space than a dog his size should. And when I get home from a job site at 6 in the evening, and he hears my truck in the driveway, he starts making a sound that is technically a howl, but which I choose to interpret as enthusiasm. I started going to the farmer's market on Saturday mornings. Not for any particular reason. I'd never been the farmer's market type, but because it got me out of the house and into a crowd, without requiring me to perform sociability, which I wasn't capable of yet. I'd walk around, buy some produce I half intended to actually cook, get a coffee, go home. There was a woman who ran a bread stand near the east entrance. Sourdough mostly, a few specialty loaves. She always had samples out on a wooden cutting board, small pieces, with a little dish of butter beside them. She was around my age, maybe a few years younger, with the kind of face that looks like it laughs easily, but also like it's been through something. I don't mean that in a sad way. I just mean she looked like a real person. I stopped for a sample the 3rd or 4th time I walked past. She said the rosemary loaf was the best one that week, and I said I'd take her word for it, and she said most people did because they weren't bread people, but they trusted her on bread. I said, "What makes someone a bread person?" She said, "They care whether the crust sounds right." I bought a loaf. I came back the following Saturday, and the one after that. I'm not ready to call it anything yet. That's not where I am. But I'll tell you what I've figured out in the past year and a half, for whatever it's worth. Being the kind of man who fixes things is only a virtue if you know which things are worth fixing. Some things look like problems to be solved. Some things are just endings that needed to happen. I thought I knew my wife. I was wrong about that. I know the difference between a load-bearing wall and a decorative one now. I should have learned it sooner. But Ford is snoring at the foot of my bed, and there's a rosemary loaf on my counter, and I woke up this morning without wondering what I didn't know. That's enough for now. For the first time in a long time, that's actually enough.